Welcome everyone who's coming in. We're getting started in a minute here. We'll get started within the next minute. We've still got a lot of people coming in every second, it looks like.
Okay.
Well, we can go ahead and start, and people can trickle in and they won't miss much. Welcome to a webinar on the topic of this terrific book, Glorious Causes, The Irrationality of Capitalism, War, and Politics, by our featured speakers here this evening, Yale, Magrass, and Charles Derber. My name's David Swanson. I'm the Executive Director of World Beyond War. Greta Zaro, our Organizing Director, and I will be helping out with questions and technical facilitation here, but our two authors will be speaking and then taking our questions and your questions. And first will be Yale Magrass, who is a Chancellor Professor of Sociology/Anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He is the co-author, along with Charles Derber, of Glorious Causes, The Irrationality of Capitalism, War, and Politics, which is our focus this evening. He is also the author of 7 other books, several of which were co-authored with Charlie, including Moving Beyond Fear, Bully Nation, and Capitalism, Should You Buy It? Both Yale and Charlie were heavily involved in the New Left of the 1960s and 1970s, including the movement against the US invasion of Vietnam. Since then, their focus has been resistance to militaristic capitalism. Yale, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I imagine very few of us are mourning Trump's likely leaving. Trump promised to make America great again. And his campaign said, keep America great, which I guess implies he succeeded. But what does great mean? United States is 45th in the world in life expectancy, 27th in education and health. It probably has, in the advanced wealthy world, the widest gap between the rich 1% and 99%. United States does lead number of people dying of COVID. It does lead number of people who have COVID. So what is it that makes America great? What does great mean? Biden's coming in, and by many standards, he probably will be an improvement. He is going to presumably re-enter the Paris Accord to combat global warming. He probably will be more effective against COVID. But he talks about bringing America back to world leadership. And he calls for honor, duty, service, country. These certainly are words we would hear from Trump. They're certainly words we would hear from various right-wing glorious leaders. What is America? What does America stand for? Well, let me read from General Patton. Americans love to fight. All real Americans love the sting and clash of battle. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. America plays to win all the time. The very thought of losing is hateful to America. Battle is the most significant competition in which a man can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base. But the real man never lets his fear of death overpower his honor. The sense of duty, notice, duty, honor, two words Biden used, and his innate manhood. The brave men will breed more brave men. Kill off the goddamn cowards, and we'll have a nation of brave men. So let's purify, eliminate any coward, anybody unfit to be an American. And later he mentioned they believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this implies, particularly to Jews, who are lower than animals. And of course, this was said immediately after World War II, when Patton was governor of Bavaria. Now, there have been a number of complaints about Trump. As we all know, Trump is considered a child who needs to be supervised by an adult. One of these adults was supposed to be General James Mattis, who he appointed as Secretary of Offense, but resigned because Biden was not going to invade Syria. Now let's hear from this adult. Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet. There are some assholes in this world who just need to be shot. They are hunters and they are victims. By your discipline, you will decide if you are a hunter or a victim. If you fuck with me, I'll kill you all. Now, of course, we live in capitalism. America prides itself as the beacon of freedom for the world. And freedom is equated with free enterprise if it is defined at all. And one thing you have to think about is, what does freedom really mean? But capitalism prides itself on rationality. Now you can ask yourself, how rational is it to promise equality when the average CEO makes over 300 times as much as the average employee? There is a calculus in rationality where you measure and weigh things. And profit is the standard of measurement. By that standard, the environment becomes an externality. Everything is supposed to be sacrificed for profit. And the more profit you have, the more rational you are. Profit is measurable. Environmental impact is more difficult. We can talk about rationality and we can ask ourselves how rational that is. We actually call this irrational rationality. Militarism is an even more extreme example where you have kill ratios and you quantify, count out how many of your own die and compare it to the number of people who died among the so-called foe. To quote Woody Allen, quoting a supposed French soldier during Love and Death. Actually, it was a Russian soldier. They were about to go to war with France. If we kill more Frenchmen, we win. If they kill more Russians, they win. Woody Allen then asked, what do you win? What do we win? Do you want to be ruled by France with all that rich food? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be American? America is under free. But what is freedom? What is this great thing for which we are supposed to sacrifice? We can talk about capitalist rationality, but underlying all this is something that's been called, probably since the Romantic reaction against the French Revolution, the irrational. Irrational was meant not to be pejorative. No, it was to imply deeper understanding. Irrational meant there supposedly was a reality that science, empiricism, observation, logic was incapable of knowing. It was something you had to feel in your gut. It was something that defined your inner being. Some people could not understand this. I frankly do not understand it at all, even though I wrote a book about it. I have no idea what it means, but be that as it may, that is a sign of how inferior I am that I have to have it explained to me. Patton made it very clear. I said that Patton made it very unclear in its clear in its unclearness. If you don't love to fight, if you don't get joy in killing, you are not a real American. To be a real American, you must want to sacrifice yourself. But you're not really sacrificing yourself, because presumably there is this other reality, this other state of being that transcends the individual, that transcends your own life, of which you can be a piece. You can experience this higher reality and merge with this greater force. It will give you meaning. Now ask yourself, we've been talking. United States, 45th in life expectancy, 27th in education and health, the highest number of deaths from COVID. This is the land of opportunity. This is the great country of freedom. How much opportunity is there really? How great is it really? If you use rational criteria, you suddenly realize America ain't so great. However, the irrational is another matter. Clear in capitalism, there are clear promises: prosperity, high standard of living, material comfort. Many Americans don't get that. If you use objective measurable criteria, capitalism does not, American capitalism does not deliver the goods it promises. So as compensation, it ends up promising delivering something else that frankly does not have its origin within capitalism. In many ways, pre-capitalism, or at least feudalism.
Yale, just to note, we're at 15 minutes.
Okay, all right, then I guess I better not go on too much further. Okay, well, anyway, the American South had the sense of valor that presumably Northerners could not understand, and the Confederacy was a fight for the real America. They were the heirs of the revolution. Interesting. When there were a movement to remove various statues, including Robert E. Lee, Trump said, "Who's next?" George Washington. Turns out, Trump probably didn't know this, Lee's slaves were the direct descendant of Washington's slaves. Mrs. Lee had inherited them from her great-grandmother, Martha Washington. So in a very real sense, the Confederacy was the real America. Go today, go to Klan rally. You see them waving American flags right next to Confederate flags. They are one and the same. And of course, Nazi Germany presented itself as representing the real Germany, a Germany that would never have surrendered in World War I. Trump won the election. Germany won World War II. Sorry, Germany won World War I. It was stabbed in the back. Victory was stolen from it. The South won the Civil War, stabbed in the back. United States won Vietnam, stabbed in the back. And if you don't understand that, you don't question that, you're obviously not a real Southerner, you're obviously not a real German, you're obviously not a real American. I can go on and on and on and on, but I'll stop now because Charlie wants to speak, and I'm sure people want to ask you questions.
Thank you, Yale. And by the way, people can post questions in the chat for Yale or for Charles, who's about to speak, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. You can also plan to use the raise hand feature and raise your hand for a turn to ask a question. But first, our second speaker out of two is Charles Derber, who is professor of sociology at Boston College and a noted public intellectual who has written 25 books, including several bestsellers reviewed in the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and other leading media. His most recent books include Welcome to the Revolution, Moving Beyond Fear, and this one, Glorious Causes. He is a co-editor of the Routledge book series, Universalizing Resistance, and is a lifelong activist for peace and justice. Charles Derber, take it away.
Okay, let me unmute myself. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yeah.
They can't reply, but yes, I think they can.
Well, hi, everybody. I know it's sort of alienating to, to be this large a group and to be in a Zoom session. So we'll try to make this relatively brief because actually Yale and I are both interested in hearing your perspectives if you get a taste of what we're writing about in this book. So I just want to touch on a few points about the book and what it's trying to do. And then I hope there are ways, in my classes when I do Zoom sessions, I usually break into small groups because I think it's just very alienating to have to listen sort of in the dark. But I hope, through the chats and questions, you guys can get a sense of being involved. So the first thing I'd say is the sort of approach I think of this book as taking is kind of related to that of Antonio Gramsci, the famous Marxist thinker, who was always thinking about the question of how capitalism, or really any system based on great, inequality or exploitation, could maintain the loyalty of the people, the rulers, how rulers could maintain the loyalty of people who were being disenfranchised and exploited. I mean, one way I think about this, like in a capitalist society, if you think of a capitalist house, it's an upstairs, downstairs house. And the people in the upstairs live very affluently and well. And more people living in the basement or the downstairs live miserably and under conditions of exploitation. And so then the question becomes, how do people upstairs maintain the loyalty and allegiance of the people in the downstairs? And particularly, how do they keep them from potentially joining with the downstairs people in other capitalist houses, from rising up in some global way against the injustices of the architecture of the capitalist house? And so in a way, this book is really about trying to answer the question of how that loyalty is maintained and the role of war and glory in maintaining that allegiance. And so the fundamental idea of the book is that a country like the United States, which has always been a pretty harsh capitalist society, is under particular long-term legitimation crises. There's always going to be a problem in a capitalist society like the United States in mobilizing the loyalty and the allegiance of most people in the country to the people living upstairs, because the gap, and we've seen this very recently become very intense since Reagan and with the rise of neoliberal globalization, the gap between the downstairs and the basement and the upstairs has become agonizingly painful and extreme. And so the problem becomes the sort of Gramscian legitimation crisis. The problem of legitimacy of the whole system becomes more acute and more important. And we think that this has always been a problem in the United States. So the US has always resorted to what we call a glorious cause to maintain a sense of unity and identity between the people downstairs and the people upstairs. And the idea is that somehow the people who are downstairs and have every reason to want to repudiate the house itself, because it treats them in many ways, both economically and culturally, abandons them in some way. The elites have figured out a way of essentially maintaining, and this is sort of part of the irrationality that Yale was talking about, a sense of glory that the downstairs can essentially embrace by identification with the greatness of the cause that the elites are carrying forward through the nation to the world. And so the glorious clause, has been in America with the idea of manifest destiny, with the idea of fighting the evils of communism, fighting the evils of terrorism. All through American history, there's been essentially a glorious cause that is a vehicle by which the glory of the nation has been put forth by elites to persuade the people downstairs that they are in fact great, and that their sense of either being overlooked or abandoned or exploited from an economic point of view or a cultural point of view can be overridden by the identification of the people downstairs with the greatness of the nation, of the wars that it wages to serve these glorious causes. So that's sort of the basic framing of the way the book is argued. And it sort of lays out historically how these different stages of glory have been framed in different periods. And, you know, you might think that, I just want to say briefly something about Trump and then about the peace movement and what the implication is for people who want to see the rise of a peace movement. The interesting thing about Trump is that in some ways, Trump appears to be repudiating this kind of glory, because remember, he ran on the idea of moving away from, quote, these silly wars. He promised to bring America out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq. And actually, he's being attacked right now by the liberal media for wanting to pull out of much of the Middle East, meaning troops in Syria, in Iraq, and so forth. And so, in a way, you would say that Trump, who seems to be sort of a symbol of a glorious cause, is in some way the opposite, in the sense that he is critiquing, you know, he's a very transactional guy. He argues that American wars have actually been perhaps good for global companies that are making profits, but not good for America, seen as America first. And it's ironic that, you know, the liberals are saying that the adults in the room, as Yale noted, are the people who have been the most hegemonic and the most militaristic. The Mattises, the CIA, the FBI, the national security state, which has really been part of the glorious cause of the nation for a long time. On the other hand, Trump really is a symbol of a glorious cause in the sense that he turns, you know, a glorious cause involves waging glorious war against enemies abroad, against evil abroad. But it also always involves waging a glorious war against enemies inside, who are in some ways even more treacherous. So the internal enemy, which in this case, in regard to Trump, is everyone from people of color to, you know, DACA immigrants to democratic socialists or liberals and elites of all kinds on the coast. Trump has elevated that war into a super glorious cause that is ripe and may perhaps requires the end of a democratic system to maintain the integrity of the country and its glory. So in some way, Trump is a very contradictory figure around the idea of what we mean by a glorious cause. He's in some way standing against the idea of American wars and American dominance abroad, but he is sort of turning that into a vicious and horrendous and frightening war within. We just saw in Michigan these militias that went out in front of the house of the Secretary of State of Michigan. And we've seen this with the governor of Michigan as well. And I'm very concerned, actually, that in the next, either before Trump leaves or afterwards, when I think Trumpism will remain, this kind of internal war in the name of excising evil and restoring glory to the nation will continue. Even as Biden brings back the glory of the established order of both parties. Now, I want to finish just by briefly talking about what this means for the peace movement. I think the peace movement, I grew up, I was in college during the Vietnam War. I was marching against the war. I'd gone to civil rights work in Mississippi right before I got to, I guess, in college, and then was always, most of my graduate school was, you know, involved with the war. And I grew up and got imprinted in a society, like I think many of you did, where there was really a very, very strong peace movement in the United States. And I think one of the things that occurred that is important in thinking about what makes a peace movement successful was that the horrors and violence of the Vietnam War were intertwined with a focus on violence at home against Blacks, with the civil rights movement, and you know, with racial injustice. And there was kind of a more, what I call an intersectional or intertwined view of peace which meant that you couldn't really develop a peace movement that was going to be successful. And this is very consistent with the theme of our book, unless you're somehow addressing the needs of the real grievances that the working people downstairs or in the basement of the upstairs downstairs house are expressing when they support war. Because the glory that resonates to them is rooted in the sense of abandonment and exploitation and disenfranchisement that the working people of the country have every reason to experience, because they have been abandoned. They've been abandoned by both parties. You know, Trump was elected because he touched on something very real, which was that the working people of the country had been culturally, and they were right, they were a flyover country, they were dismissed, they were economically more exploited than ever, the inequality gaps had grown. And so they were ripe for an attack on the Democratic Party, an abandonment. They wanted to leave the Democratic Party. This started, of course, very clearly with the Reagan Democrats, who said the Democrats are no longer speaking for us. They're speaking for the corporate globalists. And indeed, the Democratic Party after Reagan abandoned the New Deal, embraced the new sort of neoliberal and became, order, and became corporate Democrats. So what this means to me is that any kind of genuine peace movement has to recognize that the ordinary people of the country are going to resonate to glorious wars, unless they are really being vested with economic security and well-being, and with psychological and cultural affirmation, because they do live downstairs. And in a capitalist society, they are in fact being subject to grievances that they will legitimately express. And they have no place to go except to the right, unless the Democratic Party and the movements and the left speak to them in a genuine sense of respect and advocacy for their needs. And the United States has long abandoned a class politics, certainly since the New Deal. There is no class politics that's been really strongly developed. Unions, 6% of the private sector labor force is unionized. We have a Democratic Party that's become deeply corporatized and militarized in the service of neoliberal globalism. And so basically, I just want to conclude this by saying that a peace movement has got to be, if you sort of take into account the idea that elites rule through these glorious kind of military and hyper-nationalistic kinds of ventures at home and abroad, that's going to be a victorious movement until we have a kind of, into what I think we had in the 60s, which was a movement that really, Martin Luther King said he could not separate violence at home perpetrated by the economic system and by the racialized form of capitalism from wars abroad. And he said you couldn't fight one without fighting the other. And I think what's happened to the left and to the Democratic Party is they've tried to fight wars abroad without really dealing with class wars at home and without dealing with other aspects of the violence that's perpetrated by elites against so many in our own country. So this is not an argument against fighting against the hegemonic glory of America all over the world, but it's an argument that is a doomed project unless it's integrated with a fight against the class exploitation of the working people in the downstairs or the basement of the house. And to build a peace movement is to build essentially a transformative, intersectional social justice, economic justice, racialized justice peace movement. And again, I think if you look at King recognized that you could not build a civil rights movement apart from a peace movement or from a labor movement. He was killed, of course, marching in a labor issue. And he said before he died that he recognized that peace and civil rights would only come with a recognition of the importance of the development of a new class struggle for broad social and economic justice throughout the country. So I think that's the basic lesson of the book, that a peace movement needs to recognize that it grows out of these deep structural and emotional and economic, humiliation and sense of despair among the great masses of the population in capitalist societies. And peace movements can only sort of rise and to be, significant when they really speak viscerally to the gut of people whose basic sense of well-being, both psychologically and economically, is being, the need for that, the value of that can be affirmed. And just one final thing, it seems to me in COVID, you're getting a little bit of the possibility of this. If you try to think about where we might find positive things, people are saying ordinary workers who deliver, groceries to people's house, people who work as nurses' aides or hospital aides, are considered now finally really valued workers. They're valued, there's this whole notion of a heroic workforce that risks their lives every day to sort of save people in COVID. And I think that might be an opening for progressive people interested in the peace movement to speak to sort of break this divide and to say, yeah, we recognize that the labor that's being done by people in, everyday jobs, people who rightfully feel abandoned and disrespected, and that they have no merit and no worth, that there's an opportunity for progressives to sort of build on this idea that in that kind of basic work, that is not the kind of work that people in academic universities do, or that, it's not intellectual work, it's not, highly valued work traditionally in our culture, but it's something that's really central to society. And it seems to me that in that sense, COVID offers this unusual opportunity to begin a new conversation about value and the value of labor. And that in turn will be the foundation, in my view, and sort of, I think it's one way of interpreting the book, of what will build a peace movement that can once again draw the support of ordinary people. So I think I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you to Charles Derber, who's just been speaking, and to Yale Magrass, who are now going to be taking questions. If you are just showing up or you're on the phone and haven't caught on, we are talking about this book that I'm holding up, Glorious Causes, The Irrationality of Capitalism, War, and Politics. There are dozens of great questions in the chat. We will never get to them all. We will try to efficiently get to as many of them as we can, plus to questions that you ask directly by clicking the raise hand button and getting called on. Greta and I were going to take turns here. Greta, did you want to go first with a question, or should I?
I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So everyone get your virtual hands up. You can click on participants and then click raise hand, or if you're on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. So we'll let David take a question from the chat and we'll wait for those hands to go up.
Let me ask one question that's sort of based on the general impression of the chat and of our culture in general, more broadly, more so than in the chat. And that is, it seems people not only swear allegiance to a team that is a nation and its military, but also to a political party. Someone says something bad about how militaristic Trump is, and the response is typically, yeah, but Obama's worse, Biden's worse. If you mention anything bad about the militarism and warmongering of Biden or Obama, and yeah, but Trump is worse, and here's why. And of course, it's all true. They are all horrible militarists, but how do you get people off these teams and on board with simply opposing militarism, no matter who does it? And how much damage has been done by making the responsible liberal position be pro-Cold War with Russia, pro-NATO, pro-keep all the troops in Germany and Afghanistan, because it's somehow anti-Trump. Is that, I mean, this was like the least foreign policy election in US history. Nobody voted on foreign policy, but so is any significant damage done? What are people going to be thinking is their duty as their team member of a party going forward?
Well, my view of this is that they have no reason right now to be, I mean, I'm talking now about ordinary people who are not among the elites, have no reason to be strongly oriented toward either party right now. I mean, since 1980, I would say, since the end of the New Deal, the Democrats have largely, like as I was saying before, have not spoken for the interests of most of the population. They've sort of joined in. I mean, they've taken money. They've become a form of corporate Democratic Party. I'm not trying to say there aren't important differences between, I always said there have been sort of two mainstream parties in the United States, a Bush party and a Bush Light party, and they're both corporate parties. The Democrats are sort of the Bush Light. And I think that in order for people to have any serious, most Americans, of course, are not identified with either party. You know, the Republican Party has become basically a cult of Trump, and the Democratic Party has become kind of divided between progressives, you know, who are, you know, for most of us in this talk, are relatively appealing, like Bernie Sanders or AOC and so forth, and then the establishment that Biden has historically represented. And it seems to me, the question to me is less about the tribalism of the party, because I think most, you know, the majority of America is independent of either party. Over 50% of people don't identify with either party. And I think they have every reason to reject each party right now. So I think the real need is to rebuild a progressive party, which would probably be the Democratic Party, through the kinds of things I was talking about in my comments, that would try to resurrect the idea that there is a class party that is highly, you know, is essential to dealing with the problems of race and gender and the things that the Democratic Party seems to rhetorically speak to. In terms of foreign policy, both parties are hegemonic parties, highly militaristic, and I think the only thing there is to sort of move towards some sort of ways in which we rebuild the left. See, I think the left as a party, as a movement, as a social movement, has itself largely abandoned class politics. It's gotten into a siloed kind of you know, politics based on identity politics separated from class. So it involves race and gender and all kinds of other very, very important issues. But when you separate that kind of identity politics from a more general politics about the political economy of a capitalist society, you get, you know, different groups competing for different shares of the pie, rather than trying to change the whole way in which the pie is being constructed, which is what we need to change the country. So my view, that's basically my view, that basically we need to get both the progressive movements, what I call universalized. David mentioned in the introduction, I'm editing a series called Universalizing Resistance. It's based on a book I wrote called Welcome to the Revolution, which is an argument against the siloization of politics, meaning politics which is based on single issue things, but which doesn't try to look at the intertwining things that bring issues of racism and sexism and all of the other kinds of things that are talked about in a kind of isolated way into a more holistic understanding of looking at the system and all of the different components of a very exploitative society we live in.
To listen to the media, and this includes the liberal media, MSNBC, CNN, they tell us this is probably the most polarized time ever. I think that is emphatically untrue. I think if you go back, of course, Civil War, But if you go back to Vietnam, the differences among people, among what in the book we call traditionalists and cosmopolitans, people who questioned America's role in the world versus people who said no one must ever mess with America, were vastly greater than they are now. But what was different is that the two parties were less different. Go back to 1970, and the phrase liberal Republican would not be an oxymoron. Republicans and Democrats were close friends. Actually, before the 1950s, Kennedy and Nixon were close friends. What happened is the Democrats have actually moved rightward. The Republicans moved so far right that they do not live in the same world and cannot speak to each other anymore. So yes, there is far more discord in the halls of Congress. But I would suggest there's actually less division among the American people than there was then. And I think Charlie is absolutely correct. The parties do not represent the American people. There was, under Bernie Sanders, with support people like AOC, an attempt to create a genuine, we can call it progressive, anti-war, Green New Deal Democratic Party. The Democratic establishment, which is at least as militaristic as the Republican establishment, would not permit that. And of course, now we're getting Biden.
Thanks, Yale. Let's open up to some of the audience questions. I have a couple of raised hands, and I encourage people to keep raising your virtual hands. Norm, you can now unmute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
I know.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Derber. The view from Canada is, I won't speak for all Canadians, but just our history. We're not a great power, but we have accompanied Britain's jingoistic efforts in the past. In modern times, we have stayed out of wars more than we've been in them. I was interested by your analysis of, in as much as glorying war, and both speakers actually address this, and its concomitant militarism, Canada actually doesn't really have that tradition of finding glory in a military mission. That has not stopped our two main political parties, who have exchanged power and government for the last since the beginning of our country, from engaging in intense efforts to glorify our military actions from World War I. I mean, that's how far we are away from it, even though we participated in World War II. And I'm wondering if there's a thread of the glorification of patriotism that applies to middle and small states, as you might consider them, as well as great states, whether they be Russia in the old Soviet system, the United States, Britain, and other colonial powers, based on their original construction of a state, which has almost always been involved in defining those who are within that state and those who are other. And in our experience here, given that we're a country that relies extensively on immigration, The other became the first people of our country, who we call First Nations. And it's been with some interest that I've noticed that for countries that are engaging themselves in dialogue around their First Nations, is there an opportunity for kind of a general discussion or an opening for a discussion in a population about glorification of militarism, whether the country engages in it or not overtly, because of the original militarism that took place in establishing that state?
Can I?
Well,
Sorry.
yeah. No, go ahead, Yale. I'll speak quick.
Canada and the United States were both originally annexes of the British Empire. United States left much earlier. Ironically, maybe not so ironically, Canada became a sanctuary for escaped slaves. Canada was far less genocidal to its native population. And Canada, as far as I know, you, Norm, would know this better than I would, never developed the concept of manifest destiny. Yes, Canada certainly fought in the 2 world wars allied with Britain. We can debate, and David wrote an excellent book about this, whether or not World War II should have been fought. But I cannot, for the life of me, see any reason whatsoever that anyone should have ever fought in World War I. Be that as it may, Canada focused far more on improving the lives of its regular citizens than trying to build an empire where it would be the world police force. So you don't have some of the divisions, some of the problems we have here.
Yeah, Norm, I just wanted to express appreciation for your question too. And you raised this really interesting point of whether, like in small or states which really can't compete on the global stage for, global military power, whether simply, I think you were saying 2 things. One is that things that I found interesting. One was that perhaps just the formation of statehood itself in a world of sovereign states, and the kind of identity that states try to, necessarily requires some kind of glorious cause simply to create the integrity of the nation, and I think this is probably, there's a certain element of truth in that, because the world of nation states is sort of defined by the hegemonic global states. And so when you become a state, you're being drawn into, even if you're a small power, you have to sort of function as sort of by the rules of the state system that the larger states are creating. So I think remember that my friend Noam Chomsky was living in Palestine at the time that Israel, when there was a debate actually in Zionism about whether the Jews should actually form a state. And he said that simply the simple act of creating a state would lead to this kind of glory and militarism. So Noam was one of this group of people who was a Zionist, but was opposed to a Jewish state. He wanted a unitary state. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I do think that when you mention native indigenous peoples, that Canada, like other countries, may have treated its indigenous nations, with more respect, but there was still an indigenous, dominance very strongly. I mean, it was a, colonial settler nation. And I think you're right that process established at the very foundation of the nation this idea of a kind of fundamental dominance and inequality that is sort of at the root of this legitimation process that we're describing in the book. So I think you're actually touching, well, Canada may be a relatively less gloriously, driven state. It still very much has the conditions, both in terms of living in the world of hegemonic glory states and in the way of a colonial settler state, of kind of having to abide and build the statehood around some of this kind of glorious militarism. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Thanks for the great question. We've got dozens of great questions in the chat. A couple of people have pointed out to us that during this webinar, President-elect Joe Biden has picked Lloyd Austin for Secretary of so-called Defense, which means that those of us who denounced Michelle Flournoy can claim a victory, or the forces of identity politics that she was riding on backfired and defeated her. Either way, the most common and passionate question in the chat is, what do we do? How do we reduce militarism? What specific action do those of us on this call take when we get off of it? Who would like to speak to that?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think I can understand why this is the question, because like I say, I think of my own life and living in a time when there was genuinely a profoundly significant and meaningful peace movement in the United States that had major significance on a generation and on a country and changed the course of history. And, you know, I've been missing that movement for most of my life since that period. And so I understand why most people listening to this conversation want to know and want to be thinking about what has happened. And the way I think about that goes back to my original comments, which I think was that, you know, in my generation, there was and I think, again, people like Martin Luther King had an important role in this, that there was a sense that of a sort of an openness to raising sort of what I'm calling this universalizing sensibility, that you couldn't separate out these different issues of violence and repression. I mean, King kept saying, you can't separate out violence abroad from violence inside the country, and economic violence, you know, across, that was multiracial in some sense. And so my feeling is that the left is responsible for part of this problem by moving toward what I call a more siloed politics, where, you know, this is not to say that these issues that are taken up are not fundamental. They're fundamentally important. By the way, I addressed this in a new book, Noam Chomsky, I've done with Chomsky, called Chomsky for Activists, where we discuss this in great detail about how these different movements need to kind of find common ground in sort of dealing with the larger system, the larger political economy that we're in today. But the other thing I would say, again, is simply, I don't think we have easy answers for this question. I think it's a really, really hard question to answer, and we don't know how this will develop. I'm very, very worried about the persistence of a right-wing Trumpism after Trump, or, you know, with Trump out of power, that is going to create a very persistent kind of neo-fascist threat. And so I think that's very much on the horizon. So we have to deal with it at the same time that we're dealing with a new democratic, hegemonic, you know, militarism that the Biden administration is likely to push forward. And again, I think of this only that the country is in ruins. You know, we have a tiny elite in the country, and we have basically, and even many people in the elites are sort of recognizing that most of the country looks like a third world country now. It's poor. It's you know, people are going to be evicted in the millions. They're lacking jobs or health access and so forth. And so it seems to me that, you know, there is going to be an opening if, you know, the movements address the issue clearly and sort of speak to the issues that Trumpism actually built on, which was a sense of abandonment of ordinary people of both parties to sort of serve these global corporate interests, that people who want to end militarism cannot do that in a silo. They need to do that by recognizing the real life social economic emergency, health emergency, economic emergency that is necessary to address in order to build an anti-militaristic movement.
I'm going to say something ironic. If you look at Trump's literal slogan, America first. Everybody hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, if you look at Trump's literal slogan, America first, compared to Biden's, America is back, Biden's actually sounds like the more aggressive. The world wars produced total devastation in Europe. Ironically, they made United States the world hegemony, the world dominant power, and immediately after World War II, by far the world's largest economy. Immediately after World War II, United States had almost half the world's GDP. Now it's still its largest economy, but with 20% of the world's GDP, which is enough, yes, it may. But United States partially disarmed after World War I, expecting the British and French Empire to serve as the world police force. They would police the world essentially for American corporations like Exxon. After World War II, Britain and France were no longer strong enough to serve as the world police force. United States decided to assume it for itself for several reasons. One of which is it was World War II, not the New Deal, that ended the Great Depression. Ironically, I'm not recommending this, World War II brought United States a prosperity that had never seen before in the history of the world, while it simultaneously brought Europe absolute devastation. So Europe reacted, we've had 2 wars too many. Let's have Europe first. Let's focus on Japan too. Let's focus on building our domestic economy. Let's focus on improving the standard of living for our people. Now, ironically, at that time, offense was America's staple industry. And American offense industry produced all kinds of new technologies like transistors, computers, plastics. Europe and Japan decided to take American offense technology and use it to improve the quality of civilian domestic life. To the point that by the early 70s, Europe and Japan had recovered from the world wars, and they were once again able to compete with the United States. Militarism, although it brought the United States 2 decades of prosperity, ended up draining the American economy. Now, we certainly don't want the United States to experience anything like Europe and Japan did with World War II, in both world wars. But we would try to look at the lessons Europe learned and Japan learned. What do ordinary people get out of militarization? And basically what they get out is destruction. So there should be a real America First policy that focuses on improving the quality of life of American people. And that will teach, at least give a sense that maybe glory isn't so glorious.
Thanks,
Brett?
Yale. We have some other raised hands going up, and I just wanted to quickly say on this topic of, what can we do to resolve these large issues that we're talking about? I would encourage folks to look for really concrete things that you can do in your lives, such as divestment, which connects to World Beyond War's Divest from the War Machine campaign, which is something that we can all do. We don't need Biden or Trump or Congress. Divestment allows us to take action in our own hands to change our banking practices, to change where our universities put their endowments, etc. So I just wanted to put a plug in for the divestment campaign when people are asking for, what can we practically do? And we'll also be talking about some practical peace building tools at a webinar in 2 weeks about permaculture and farming and building a local peace economy. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, we have more questions here. So Desmond, you can now unmute.
Yay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hey, very, very stimulating. And I have to say, the speakers have raised too many issues for us to resolve here. Thank you. But I want to point out a couple of things. One of the things I wanted to mention was during the Vietnam War, we were getting drafted. After the Vietnam War, that has stopped. That's a big incentive for a peace movement, the threat of being drafted. So the creation of this professional army resulted in a big drop in stimulus for people to be anti-war. Somebody else is fighting the war, But one other comment that nobody here has mentioned, what I've seen in the peace movement, and you can see it when we look at the people attending these webinars on peace issues and so forth, is that we don't have younger people by and large. The peace movement people that I'm aware of are older people, say my age. I mean, I'm 73. I was part of the Vietnam War resistance, but we don't have the ability at this point to pull younger people into this movement. And that's something we need to somehow crack, I think, hopefully. It's a big gap right now, and I can't totally explain why we're just not communicating with them. We're not using the right media, maybe the right social media or something, but that is a real issue. Your talk about, Charles, in particular, about the Democratic Party abandoning the working people, that is very accurate. And Thomas Frank has written about that. If you've seen his book, Listen Liberal, he talks about that specifically. And he says the Democratic Party in the 70s started shifting away, and its constituency is now professionals as opposed to working class people. But also, of course, the corporate world has apparently, to some extent, found the Republican Party too extreme for them. And they've migrated to the Democratic Party also, and you've talked about the deep state, and that is, I think you've talked about it. I mean, the national security state, very Democratic Party. But one of the things I just wanted to mention this is, we think of working class people in general as being, as you say, patriotic, signing up for the glory. That kind of gives them a cause in some cases, and that's a legitimate point. But I think that, in fact, a lot of working class people are not so attracted to going over and fighting wars. They often go in the service because they don't have many other economic options, and that definitely is an economic path for them, to join the service. And but just I don't want to keep talking. I'm just going to make one last point here, and that is that to get a real working class joining with us, the Democratic Party, as you said, doesn't really offer working class people a lot. And one of the parts of this, I read a book, came out in 2000, called America's Forgotten Majority, The White Working Class Still Matters, or something like that. the majority of voters in this country are white working class people. And to a great extent, a lot of them don't see the Democratic Party as being for them. Now, this is a mixed bag, but that's what, and why is that? Well, part of it is we got to get, I think, the Democratic Party away from this identity politics. We have a lot of racial injustice, tremendous in this country. We have to work on that. But unfortunately, what's happening is if you looked at the convention, the Democratic Party convention, I think the large majority of people were representing different states, the Democratic Party, were people of color. Okay, now, wait a minute, that's good in a way. We want to have people of color well represented. However, I heard a comment by a Trump supporter who said, well, that party favors a certain group of people. And white working class people see this and they think, well, the Democratic Party is not really for me. It's for people of color. And there's a few white people in it, but it's majority oriented towards people of color. And there's a lot to that. And just one last thing, I read a book called Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? Very strongly recommended. And I forget the author, he's with, Anyway, he pointed out in the 2016 Democratic Convention, there was a sequence where they had people standing up and being recognized throughout the convention. And there were about somewhere between 20 and 30 of these people. Not one was a white man. If you are not portraying yourself, your movement, or your party as something that has speaking to and representing the majority of voters in the country, you got a problem.
Thanks, Desmond. We're going to give the speakers a chance to respond, and then
I'll shut up now. Thank you.
No, Desmond, I think you've very much shared and elaborated on sort of things that we've been arguing, that the Democratic Party has sort of become a party of identity politics around race and gender and other very important things, but movements which are can become really kind of, as you say, that they're going to move much of the country toward, much of the working people who are white and male in the country away from the Democratic Party. And in fact, as you know, the majority of white people in the country vote Republican, of all white people. And if you take white men, it's overwhelmingly so. And it represents, but if you take even like white men and women, and particularly down ballot in the current election, they voted Republican. And I do think this reflects the fact of what you're describing, and that we were trying to say earlier in our presentation, that, you know, the Democratic Party, and to some extent, the left movements on the ground have not really spoken to, you know, a multiracial economic and political transformation. It's become a more siloed kind of politics, and it's been very destructive to the possibility of a real progressive movement, which has to be a multiracial movement. I mean, the majority of the working population actually in America is female and people of color. So it's not a question of saying, well, we have to just focus on white males. White males are a diminishing fraction, but you're right. They're still a very, very important, and whites in general are still a very important. And Republican politics has in some sense become, you know, glory has become built around identity politics of whiteness, you know, which is a very long history. There's a chapter in the book about the Confederacy and about how we're constantly sort of building on a tradition of glory built on whiteness and from the South and from you know, racial struggles long in the country. So, and basically on the issue of the draft, you know, my students often raise this. They say, when I ask them, why aren't you more focused? Because in my Peace and War class, which I hope to bring David to again, you know, I do ask them, why don't we have a large youth peace movement? The one issue that seems to respond on campus today and where the divestment movements and so forth are around the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I think for reasons that I don't fully understand, that issue has become an issue among young people. So on many campuses, there are, divestment movements and others that try to speak up for recognizing that the United States support of Israel is essentially a way of America seeking to dominate the Middle East and the world in general. So, but I think the idea of resurrecting the draft as a way to, build resistance among the young, while it might have a certain pragmatic attraction, is quite dangerous, because once you enshrine, the draft and of course it still exists, it can be mobilized at any point. It sort of builds into people's consciousness, and particularly people who don't have much privilege, that military service is essential to the nation and is, something that we want to empower. And so I think it's sort of a dangerous solution. But I agree entirely with your idea that the left and the Democratic Party are opening the door to the migration of whites, and particularly white males, to the Republican Party and to right-wing glory. And that's a very dangerous thing.
I'm going to say something ironic. When I was young, and I'll bet this was an experience of many of the other people in this webinar when they were young, I was constantly harassed by the police. I would be walking down the street, I would be stopped, demand to show my driver's license, walking. At the time I didn't have a driver's license. They would want to know where I was going, who I was going to see. That is an experience that young white males went through continually at that time. I'll bet many people in this room, in this webinar, had that experience. It is horrible. And of course, police harassment of people of color is also horrible. But what are white males told? White males are told, this is a Black experience. You know nothing about it. The police are on your side. No, the police are not on their side. If you created instead a movement that said all people of all colors are oppressed, all people of all colors are harassed by the police. In other countries, social services are universal. Everyone gets them. What in fact we have here instead is this racialized, genderized way of distributing social services. You have to fall into a certain category. And if you do not fall into that category, you are not eligible. If you are a student, or if you are a not very rich person, you still face enormous debt. But if your income goes over a certain margin, you're not eligible for support. If instead of focusing on what can be called caste identity politics, where you have to fall into a certain category, ironically, this is something Sanders proposed, and this is part of the reason why Sanders lost nomination. You universalize it, make everyone eligible. Everyone is harassed by the police. Everyone needs financial aid. Everyone needs a good job. And say this is an interest in which everyone shares, regardless of gender, regardless of race. You might be able to overcome the idea that if you don't fall in a particular identity group, the left, the liberals Democrats have nothing to say to you, so join the Republicans. I also want to say that I would immediately withdraw from any movement that endorsed the draft. That to me is a litmus test. A wall will not be passed. Anyone who supports the draft, I will not support.
I'm with you on the draft, Yale, and I suspect the Pentagon views its top enemy in the world as making college part of public education, not China, not Iran, not North Korea.
Absolutely.
Let me see if I can maybe squeeze in 3 semi-related questions, and maybe you two can try to answer them before we officially run out of time. We may go a little long if everyone wants to, but some people have asked, how do we get rid of this idea that the United States should lead? You know, all these topics where the United States is way behind every other country, and the question is not should it catch up, but when will it lead? The usual question: how can we redefine patriotism in a productive, beneficial way? Or my personal addition: why the hell can't we outgrow it and get rid of it? And third, how does jingoistic militarism function when elites are transnational? Has this changed how that functions?
Now, the irony is elites may be transnational, but citizens are not. It is very easy to move capital anywhere in the world. It is very easy, relatively easy, to close down a factory and move it to Indonesia or Brazil. But the people who work in that factory are left behind. So what we have to emphasize is so-called American greatness means exactly that: American great military, the American military that protects corporate investment and does not protect the American people. In fact, instead, allows corporations to invade other countries and export jobs, export people's livelihoods, export people's real security. And I agree with you, David, 100%. Patriotism is a word we should never use. When we talk about American exceptionalism, American greatness, what we need to emphasize is that greatness has given nothing to perhaps the majority of the American people. Germany was committed to German greatness. We know what that left them. Germany decided to abandon greatness, abandon patriotism, and now the German people are actually more prosperous than American people, and they're not worried about Germany destroying the Biosphere by pushing button. They're not worried about Germany initiating another world war. If anyone initiates another world war, it goes to the United States.
Yeah, so a few comments. I think the times are ripe to, David, the first question you discussed was how to move away from focus on leadership toward something different for America. I think because of the kind of depression that we're entering and of COVID and the extreme inequality, I think Trumpism essentially, in a way, exploited that. Trump said, I'm going to go back to a kind of isolationism. This was to some degree rhetorical, but he really was speaking to what I think was real, which was that Americans were getting tired of the wars because they realized that domestic situations were eroding so drastically for themselves. And so when Trump said, America first, people were sort of saying, enough of this going abroad for, America, losing, they associated leadership in the world. I think they were beginning to understand that this was bad for ordinary people in the United States. It would meant jobs were going abroad and that resources were going abroad and they weren't coming back to Americans. So, and particularly in the middle of a health crisis and an economic crisis, which is probably unprecedented, maybe in the history of the country over the next few years, I think that there may be an opening, David, for this issue of moving the country away from the idea that the well-being of the country is going to be served by America pouring trillions into global military dominance, particularly global wars. On the other hand, I will just say that, the most urgent issues of our time are global extinction related to global climate change and global nuclear war. And therefore, we do need some notion of global cooperation in order to, have human life survive. I mean, the greatest real challenge to the future of the world is whether human life or what is it, 1,000 species, every year are disappearing or more. That is the overriding concern, and it is a global issue. So maybe the way you deal with the issue of patriotism is to say the real patriotism, if you're going to use that language, is around dealing with these global crises that require a sort of subordination of traditional ideas of national sovereignty and greatness to the idea of some sort of, collective security and democratic governance regionally, locally, and globally, where power is moved up toward global, global Green New Deals and global disarmament, and down toward local, divestment of the kind that Greta was talking about, and local agriculture and local environmental sustainability. And so power goes up from the nation toward these global extinction threats to, global governance structures that are beyond the nation state, that deal with trying to save life of all kinds, and down from the nation state toward localities where people are producing in a way that's consistent with survival, of the environment and some sort of sustainable global economy. And I don't think that means necessarily, I understand Yale's, horror at the word patriotism. It's interesting that when they do global surveys of which countries have the greatest patriotism and the least, Yale is right. The country with the developed country with the least patriotism in the world is Germany, because I think they recognized what patriotism led to. At the same time, if you sort of just say, I don't give a shit about the country and I'd like to destroy America, it's not a very good way to build support. I think the way to do it is to say the responsibility of the country is toward these urgent cooperative global initiatives that can save humanity and the rest of life, and down. And that there is an opening now. I think Trump exploited it. There's an opening now that's very real in the country where people are sick of this idea that the US should lead these global wars, that we need to reinvest in the well-being of our local communities and a kind of making peace with the planet that requires a new relation to nature and to our local worlds.
We're 2 minutes from scheduled ending. Greta, do you want to try to get another question in here?
Sure, I think we can squeeze one in. Isvara, you can now unmute.
Thank you. I was very surprised that none of you mentioned the newly formed People's Party in this country. I'm not from this country. I'm not an American, but I've been attending their meetings. They're all under 40. They're joining by the thousands. Please do research on them because they're addressing exactly all these issues. And it looks to me that our generation and their generation are not in touch. It's very amazing to me. And it was formed by the people that came out, people who were at the, in New York, in the movement, the Occupy movement, and by people, and by the head, some of the heads of Bernie Sanders campaigns, the young people that were working on the different states. So please check, maybe in our next webinar, I would love to hear people talk about what they think about it. It's called the People's Party, or the Movement for a People's Party, but it was finally finalized on the 3rd of December. just a few days back, I attended their ceremony of opening, and the young people are joining by the thousands. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to say that I live in a state, Massachusetts, where there was just a vote on ranked voting. It was turned down, but it was sort of a recognition that people like the Working Families Party in New York, that there's a lot of consideration, I agree with you, among young people, since the major parties are not really speaking to their needs. They may want to join with Sanders and AOC, but are also open to forming these new parties. I don't think these are dichotomous choices necessarily, and there are ways of structuring the electoral system so that you encourage kinds of multi-new parties at the same time that you don't abandon trying to transform, like the Democratic Party, for example, or bring some sort of,
Yes, and they don't accept corporate money. That's very important.
Yeah.
They don't want to have anything to do with corporations. So
Right.
that is very
you
important.
can fight for that, but you can also fight for Citizens United and for getting the Democratic Party to reject corporate money as well, right? These are not mutual. You try to move on all these approaches simultaneously. But thank you for raising that. It's really quite important.
Yale or Charles, do you want to make any closing remarks as we run out of time here?
Well, I hope people will stay. I hope there'll be more questions still. So do we really need to make a close, or can we continue?
Kind of hard to take a poll of people. We could try to do a couple more questions if you all are interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think Yale and I are willing to stay a little bit longer if people would like to, there are urgent sort of questions that people are sort of like to throw at us, yeah.
Well, I'll give you another question or two from the chat, and here's one. How important is reducing military spending? This is a number of people asked this. It is, of course, very important to some of us. And there is, of course, a bill in Congress right now that would dump over $740 billion just into the Pentagon's piece of US military spending, but rename bases that are named for Confederates for other killers. So it's a progressive, liberal initiative, which, as I mentioned earlier, also would prevent bringing a single troop home from Germany in any sort of rash, mere 75 years, or ending the war on Afghanistan too recklessly after only a couple of decades. So how central should reducing military spending, moving military spending to something else be in what we're talking about here?
Okay, David, I could not agree with you more. I don't care what you call military bases. I'd rather see them close altogether. We are told the United States is not an aggressive country, that it means well across the world. It maintains bases on conservatively 80 other countries. It is an empire and octopus that has invaded most of the rest of the world. Now, by the Pentagon's own figures, if the real goal of the Department of Offense, which used to call Department of War, were defense, it would require a budget on the order of $3 billion, less than 2% of the current budget. So reducing offense spending by 98% is not a bad idea. Now, if you look at, Bernie Sanders did say, take $5 trillion from offense and spend it on creating a Green New Deal. Yes, look at climate change, look at the environment, look at the infrastructure, look at creating jobs, look at your education, look at medical care, look at the resources that the military absorbs, and think about how they could be spent on other things that would vastly improve the quality of civilian life, that in fact would make it very clear there is nothing gloriousness. all you get out of glory is death and destruction. Take those resources and use it to improve the quality of life of American people. Yes, even use Trump's slogan, America first, and let Europe say what you did, Europe first.
Yeah, I think the issue about this is that, the military has, every congressional district in the country has a military facility. So if you radically cut military spending, you radically cut jobs. And that was orchestrated as a very sophisticated way that the military sort of enshrined big military spending into every budget. But I think that, way back in, the 60s, Seymour Melman was writing about conversion of military plants and military facilities into economic, civilian, and shown, Melman was an engineer as well as a peace theorist, and showed that it was quite possible to take workers in most military facilities and have them cooperatively develop ways of taking over military companies and military contractors and converting them into cooperatives or businesses that would contribute to the environment, to clean energy, it turns out the technology is quite adaptable to really vital needs that we have. So again, because jobs are so, public investment in public goods is so incredibly, in short supply right now, and the military budget is so large. Remember that every war is paid for separately from the DoD budget. The Iraq War was paid not out of a percent of the Pentagon's budget. It came out of special appropriations, $3 trillion. So there's an enormous amount of money. Trump has upped the military budget, including particularly tactical nuclear weapons and weapons that are scarily usable. One of the most dangerous things, Trump's legacy, is sort of building up, even on the Russian border, this kind of operation and getting rid of the various kinds of arms control agreements that make it very, very likely that tactical nuclear weapons will be used in conventional war and so forth. So it's really extremely urgent that the military budget get cut back. For the sake of preserving life on the planet. Long ago, I did a book called The Nuclear Seduction, which said, the real concern about nuclear war is not the number of nuclear weapons, it's the escalation of conventional war into nuclear war. And that is the way most nuclear war is likely to happen. Trump has laid the groundwork, and I'm not at all certain that Biden will reject it, for basically putting in place a conventional, and then a miniature, a sort of the fire break between conventional and nuclear weapons is going to be erased. And it's very likely that one can imagine a confrontation under the Biden administration with Russia, where a conventional war could escalate into a nuclear war. So I think it's incredibly urgent to reduce nuclear spending, particularly on all these new nuclear programs and other weapons of mass destruction. And at the same time, making clear to working people how much, because I don't think people really understand how much of their, like Yale said, there's this mythology that World War II means that war is always good for the economy. And in fact, it's depleting, as Melman made clear 50 years ago, it's depleting the capital that can be available for domestic public investment on public goods, and particularly on infrastructure for clean energy. So I think there's just an overwhelming argument for, and I think it would be, if understood and presented politically, there's an overwhelming argument for cutting the spending on nuclear weapons and for almost the entire hegemonic, front line, where, we're not only have 800 military large bases, but all these so-called lily pads of small bases that Obama put forward for fighting terrorism in Africa and so forth, all of which are costing huge amounts of money for no good purpose whatsoever, really dangerous. So I think it's a huge issue.
Melman and other people right at the same time, like Ron Sweezy, pointed out that that American offense technology was not used to improve the American economy. Instead, Europe and Japan took American military technology, like transistors, talked about before, chips, computers, and used it to build their civilian economy. They took American discoveries and used it to improve the quality of the life of their people. The United States did not do that. The United States did the opposite.
Right.
United States, sorry.
Greta, did you want to try to get in one more question from a
We
participant?
don't have any virtual raised hands at the moment.
You don't. Okay, maybe I can get in one last question from the chat. Someone asked a question about military advertisements. Should militaries of the United States or any other country be allowed to advertise, sponsor race cars, put up billboards, spend literally $1 billion a year marketing themselves? And I would add, this is going on while under international law. In theory, war propaganda is illegal. But in the mythology of US militarism, building up the military isn't war. It's somehow different from war. Even the peace groups and the anti-war think tanks sort of put out the cost of war in recent years, and it's some fraction of military spending, as if most military spending is for something other than war. So it's not war propaganda. What is your view, Charles and Yale, on military advertising?
We see so much of American education organized around building a mindset where the only way to prove yourself is to fight. The way to be glorious is to become a soldier. Schools have drills. Every day children are supposed to salute the flag. Go to any sports event, it begins with a display of colors. Very often, bomber planes fly overhead. Everywhere you turn, you see a recruiting office. And certainly, we have noticed since the draft has been abolished, and I think it was Charlie or somebody else, I think it was also Norm, said there really is a draft. The draft is called poverty. The draft is called lack of opportunity. The draft is called deteriorating schools, deteriorating infrastructure, so that there's no real alternative to military. Certainly, we should not allow military recruiters anywhere near schools. Now, somebody said, well, shouldn't everyone have the right of free speech? Okay, let's have the Iranian and the Russian armies recruit on our campuses, on our schools. If American military has right to do that, so do they. It's obviously an absurd proposal, but it will point out the absurdity of using schools, using sports, using media, using games like Valor and computer games to make people think war is fun and war is something they want to do.
I think a lot of our work in general, Yale and I have written a number of books, as David pointed out together, is about how militarism is a melding of kind of a global, crusade in the world with a complete transformation of the society at home, so that a militarized, a hegemonic power that is fighting wars all over the world is always trying to promote a kind of internal, making society, in a sense, a branch of the military. The society becomes the internal heart of the military. So I think the most scary thing that we've seen under Trump is the direct use of the military for policing and the sort of, for example, this is happening globally. The Israeli military is training the Tufts police force on the Tufts campus. In fact, the Israeli military and the American military are increasingly involved in training and providing equipment to both urban police forces and campus police forces. And so this notion of advertising and use of military is in the way just one sort of surface expression of a much deeper ways in which the military is seeking to sort of create the sort of heart and soul of every institution. I was pointing out before that every congressional district is based on drawings that have to do with military jobs. And so you're building an economy in which there's a sense that if you rip out the military, you rip out the job structure of the country. That's being reflected culturally. You know, it's natural then that if jobs are tied to military, that, you know, you're integrating the idea of a free enterprise capitalist system with advertising. And so military advertising just becomes part, and maybe a very central part of the way, you know, what is capitalism? It's about the production of goods for a military society. So I think the opposition to allowing this kind of bringing the war home, you know, as the country becomes more concerned with the well-being of, one of the great dangers is that they will try to elevate the domestic economy by militarizing it. You know, America is making money most of all abroad now by weapons, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, selling weapons to the Emirates and so forth. And this new conflict with Iran, they can do that domestically as well. The big source of profit with drones of all kinds and so forth will be militarized products that get used, you know, on the border and so forth. So I think the whole logic is that there's a seamless, the role of the military is kind of seamlessly uniting in a glorious national construction of the state. In the military, where there's a failure to be able to distinguish the domestic military and the society at home militarily from a global military crusade. And that's really what a peace movement has to be. That's why it has to be directed toward wiping out this whole set of military values, the violence at home, the military institutions entering all the major forms of economic and political and policing that's emerging in America today. So I think it's a holistic vision that, you know, fighting for peace is not simply fighting against wars abroad, it's fighting for a sort of peace and justice agenda in the United States.
Very well said. People still looking for things to do. If they haven't found the dozens and dozens of things they can do in the chat, if you are in the United States, the US Congress is looking right now at whether to stop selling weapons to the United Arab Emirates, and that would be something you could call your Miss Representative and senators on immediately. If you live anywhere on this planet, you can go to WorldBeyondWar.org and do a million things, including clicking the link to petition President-elect Biden to seize the soonest opportunity to end the sanctions on Iran and restore decent relations with Iran, which is likely to elect a government in June. If he doesn't, that won't be interested in negotiations of any sort. We have been listening tonight to two wonderful speakers and authors, and I'm going to suggest a very old-fashioned thing you can do to advance some of these new ideas, and that is to read a damn book, for God's sake, and make it this one. Glorious Causes, the Irrationality of Capitalism, War, and Politics, which actually answers all of the questions that have been brought up in the chat, the ones we were able to get to and the ones we weren't, and many more. Thank you very, very much to everyone who's been here for the terrific questions, for your participation, for everything you do. Thanks, Greta, and thank you especially to Charles Derber and Yale Magrass.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, it was great, David and Greta. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for bearing with the new technology of conversation these days. We really enjoyed it. It was great.
Our pleasure.
Really excited that you allowed us to make this presentation.
Yeah.
Our pleasure. Thanks very much. People are waving and clapping hands if you don't see them. Until next time.
Okay.